The scream was short, high-pitched, and then it cut off, abruptly, as if extinguished mid-breath. Moments later, surveillance footage captured a woman bursting into the storage room of a Circle K gas station in Pensacola, Florida. Her body was engulfed in flames. Skin peeled from her arms and face in thick, wet sheets. Her mouth was open, but she made no sound. The smell of burning flesh overtook the narrow space as customers and employees froze in horror. One witness dropped a drink. Another screamed. A man ran for a mop bucket and hurled its filthy water toward her, dousing the flames with a hiss. The victim collapsed on the floor, her breath shallow and erratic. Sections of her face and upper torso were no longer recognizable. Her skin had already begun to blister and separate. A melted trail of plastic and fuel residue marked the path from the front of the store to the back room. The attacker was no longer present. Initial police responders described the scene as one of the most disturbing in recent memory. Burned clothing, a half-empty gas can, the stench of accelerant, and human tissue charred onto the tile floor provided immediate evidence of a deliberate act of violence. This was not an accident, nor an improvised assault. It was a targeted ignition event, executed with precision. Within 20 minutes, investigators confirmed that the suspect, a woman later identified as Betty Jean Fields, had entered the store carrying a plastic fuel container. Security footage showed no verbal exchange, no warning, and no immediate provocation. She approached the victim, doused her with gasoline, ignited a match, and set her ablaze. This type of offense fits a rare but well-documented pattern of expressive violence. Acts intended not only to harm, but to destroy the physical identity of the victim. Fire is an intimate weapon in such contexts. It lingers. It transforms. The use of accelerant indicates premeditation, and the targeting of the victim's upper body, particularly the face, suggests symbolic erasure rather than simple injury. Fields fled the scene on foot, but did not leave the area. She was apprehended less than an hour later, within walking distance of the crime scene. At the time of her arrest, she was barefoot, incoherent, and reeked of gasoline. Her statements to officers were fragmented and delusional. She referenced white people, heroin, and prison in the same sentence. She laughed at moments of silence and mumbled to herself while handcuffed. Her behavior displayed features consistent with active psychosis, disorganized speech, persecutory ideation, and apparent hallucinations. However, these symptoms existed alongside evidence of planning. She obtained a gas can from a nearby residence, requested money for fuel, and targeted a specific location during daylight hours. The ability to prepare, travel, and select a vulnerable individual demonstrates retained executive functioning, challenging the assumption that she was acting solely under psychotic compulsion. From a criminological standpoint, this raises essential questions about motive and agency. Was the attack the result of paranoid delusion? Was the victim chosen arbitrarily, or did she symbolize something within the offender's distorted internal logic? Did the act represent displaced rage, a psychotic response to a perceived slight, or a calculated expression of control? There were no indications that the offender knew the victim, no prior altercations, no evidence of dispute. The absence of relational context eliminates common triggers such as revenge or interpersonal conflict. This suggests the victim was selected not for who she was, but for where she was, present and accessible at the moment of psychotic or symbolic release. The crime scene, once analyzed, supported this conclusion. The accelerant was poured in a directed manner. The ignition source was controlled and intentional. The lack of collateral damage, no fire spread, no destruction of property, indicates that the act was not intended to create chaos, but to inflict maximal personal harm. Offenders who employ fire in this manner often demonstrate a complex relationship with violence. It is not simply about causing death, but about the transformation of the victim into a vessel for psychological expression. Whether driven by mental illness, trauma, or unresolved delusional constructs, the fire becomes both weapon and language, conveying rage, fear, and dominance in a form that words cannot. As emergency personnel transported the victim to a burn trauma center across state lines, investigators began piecing together the offender's timeline. The questions remained. Why fire? Why now? And above all, why her? The answers would emerge slowly through interrogation footage, forensic interviews, and psychiatric evaluations. But in the silence, after the flames were extinguished, one reality became clear. This was not a moment of chaos. It was an act of intention. And somewhere in that intention, something had broken long before the match was ever lit. After her arrest, Betty Jean Fields was transported to an interview room within the Escambia County Sheriff's Office. Surveillance footage shows her entering in silence, her posture loose, gaze unfocused. At first glance, her demeanor suggested confusion or intoxication, but further interaction revealed a more complex clinical picture. Her speech patterns fluctuated between barely coherent mumbling and sudden pressured monologues. She asked for soda, demanded her rights, and veered into conversations about God, social services, and people trying to set her up. Her responses bore no apparent logical structure. This interview provided the first substantial glimpse into the psychological framework behind the attack. Fields described hearing voices and referenced unseen threats. When asked why she had set a woman on fire, she alternated between denial, partial admissions, and deflection. At one moment, she claimed it had nothing to do with the victim. Moments later, she admitted she wanted her to burn, but followed with uncertainty about who the intended target really was. This fragmentation is indicative of psychotic disorganization, but it occurred alongside persistent signs of retained lucidity. Throughout the interrogation, Fields demonstrated an unstable but strategic awareness of consequence. She asked whether her actions had been caught on camera. She inquired about the victim's condition with a disturbing level of interest, specifically the extent of the burns, the areas affected, and whether the victim had survived. These questions were not framed with remorse, but rather curiosity. Her tone lacked affect. She did not cry. She did not appear distressed. This emotional absence raised immediate concerns regarding empathy, impulse control, and emotional regulation. Historically, offenders who exhibit both active psychosis and structured behavioral planning represent one of the most challenging profiles in forensic psychology. Fields had retrieved a gas can from a nearby residence. She had solicited money from a stranger to purchase fuel. She had re-entered the gas station with intent. These steps imply a form of instrumental reasoning, even if the final act emerged from a psychotic trigger. The decision to use fire as a weapon supports this interpretation. Unlike edged weapons or blunt force, fire demands proximity, preparation, and timing. The attacker must remain present until the moment of ignition. The act cannot be easily reversed once committed. Such a method indicates a high level of commitment to the outcome, suggesting a deep-seated emotional or symbolic motive. In Fields' case, that motive was not immediately accessible, but her language hinted at themes of persecution, racial grievance, and perceived disrespect. She referred vaguely to white people in the store, described an unspecified provocation, and framed her actions as a response to perceived injustice. However, the surveillance footage and eyewitness testimony showed no prior interaction between Fields and the victim. The absence of conflict supports the hypothesis that the act was not retaliatory, but projective. Projective violence occurs when an individual assigns internal suffering to an external object or person, creating a narrative that justifies harm. This form of violence often emerges in individuals with persecutory delusions. The offender believes they are being targeted, mocked, or controlled. The victim, often a stranger, becomes a stand-in for a generalized oppressor or source of pain. This psychological mechanism does not require rational justification. It operates within the closed loop of psychotic thought. When the system is reinforced by years of instability, trauma, or social abandonment, the potential for explosive violence increases. Fields' prior criminal record included multiple arrests, some involving aggression toward service workers and law enforcement. In one instance, she attacked a store clerk who had asked her to leave the premises. In another, she bit and scratched a responding officer. These patterns of behavior illustrate a chronic inability to manage perceived confrontation. The use of force in response to boundary setting is common among individuals with cluster B personality features, particularly when co-occurring with psychotic disorders. Her reference to not caring whether the victim lived or died also signals a diminished capacity for moral reasoning during the act. Whether this is attributable to illness, personality pathology, or substance-induced disinhibition remains a central forensic question. Fields admitted to using crack cocaine, though toxicology was inconclusive at the time of arrest. Substance use may have exacerbated her symptoms, but the degree of organization in her actions points to a long-standing pattern, not a single episode of drug-induced psychosis. The interview ended with Fields laughing to herself, nodding in silence, and murmuring disconnected phrases. Her emotional flatness never broke. Even when told the victim might die, she asked only if the store had burned down. She showed no reaction when informed of the second woman burned during the attempt to help. Her focus remained on the mechanics of the event, not its meaning. At this stage, a critical diagnostic distinction must be made. Was Betty Jean Fields operating under a delusional belief system that rendered her incapable of understanding right from wrong at the moment of the offense? Or did she understand the nature of her actions, even if she could not fully grasp their human consequence? That distinction would determine not only her legal responsibility, but also the ethical framework through which society would attempt to judge her. The victim, Joey Helck, remained unconscious for several days after the incident. Her injuries covered a significant percentage of her upper body, including extensive third-degree burns to her arms, neck, and face. Medical documentation confirmed severe damage to dermal tissue, compromised respiratory function from inhalation injury, and risk of multi-organ failure. She was placed in a medically induced coma, requiring intubation and critical care monitoring. The attending trauma team prioritized fluid resuscitation and infection control while simultaneously initiating preparation for surgical debridement and skin grafting. The physical consequences of the attack were immediate and life-threatening, but the broader psychological and social dimensions soon became evident. Helck was the primary caregiver to multiple children and had been employed at the Circle K for over a year. Her role in both her family and her workplace was defined by consistency and routine, elements violently stripped away in a matter of seconds. The loss of bodily autonomy, coupled with visible disfigurement, introduced long-term vulnerabilities not only in physical function, but in identity, stability, and self-perception. From a forensic victimology perspective, such injuries carry residual impacts far beyond the event itself. Survivors of flame-related assaults often experience extended trauma symptoms, including intrusive memories, sleep disturbances, anxiety, and social withdrawal. These symptoms are intensified when the assailant is a stranger, and the attack occurs in a public space, as was the case here. The perception of random victimization can lead to persistent hypervigilance and disrupted trust in public safety. Helck later recalled seeing the attacker only briefly, moments before the ignition. She reported no interaction, no conversation, and no warning. This absence of interpersonal context heightened the psychological dissonance of the trauma, making it difficult for the victim to process the event within a meaningful narrative framework. Victims in such cases often struggle with what is clinically referred to as sense-making, the ability to integrate the trauma into a coherent account of personal experience. The lack of motive, reason, or relationship leaves a vacuum where understanding might otherwise begin. The bystander who intervened with a mop bucket sustained no physical injuries, but later reported symptoms consistent with acute stress response. Another employee, who attempted to extinguish the flames on Helck's body, sustained minor burns to her forearm. While the injuries were medically minor, the psychological impact of being present during a burn assault cannot be overstated. Exposure to extreme violence in enclosed spaces is strongly correlated with secondary trauma among witnesses, particularly when the event involves sensory overload, sight, sound, and smell all converging in a confined environment. Socially, the aftermath of the incident disrupted not only the victim's life but the surrounding community. The Circle K location temporarily closed. Coworkers resigned or requested reassignment. Customers reported reluctance to return. Incidents of public violence, especially when highly visible and seemingly random, often produce what is known in behavioral science as proximity fear, the belief that everyday locations are no longer safe, even in the absence of a statistical increase in risk. Forensic analysis of the physical evidence confirmed the absence of accidental ignition. The directionality of the fuel pattern, the ignition point, and the spatial confinement of the burn zone indicated precise targeting. This undermined any argument of impulsivity or loss of control. The physical evidence suggested deliberation. The psychological impact on the victim reinforced that conclusion. The offender had not merely attacked the body, but had intentionally inflicted wounds that would alter appearance, social function, and personal identity. Burns to the face and hands are particularly significant in forensic trauma assessment. These areas are neurologically sensitive, socially expressive, and essential for basic functioning. Damage to them disrupts not just physical movement, but interpersonal connection. Survivors often report avoidance by strangers, discomfort from children, and challenges maintaining employment or intimate relationships. These outcomes form a secondary layer of victimization, experienced long after the event itself. The broader question now shifts toward reconstructing what internal framework led the offender to such a violent and destructive act against someone unknown, unarmed, and unprovocative. Was the injury to the face symbolic? Was it meant to silence, to erase, to punish? Or was it simply the result of psychotic fragmentation, an unfiltered discharge of paranoid rage? Understanding this distinction will be critical in assessing not only legal culpability, but also the public risk she might continue to pose. The pattern of harm inflicted on Helck suggests something more than random aggression. It reflects intent shaped by distorted perception, and a psychological need that violence appeared, at least momentarily, to satisfy. During subsequent evaluations, Betty Jean Fields was placed under court-ordered psychiatric observation to determine her competency to stand trial. Clinical interviews revealed a long-standing diagnosis of schizophrenia, dating back over a decade, with intermittent compliance to treatment. She exhibited hallmark symptoms of paranoid delusions, auditory hallucinations, and flattened affect. Her behavior in custody remained erratic, fluctuating between cooperative engagement and fragmented monologues directed at unseen figures. She referred to surveillance cameras as spies, expressed fear of being poisoned, and questioned whether she was already dead. Despite these symptoms, evaluators noted her ability to recall chronological details, identify legal personnel by role, and describe her version of the incident with selective clarity. When asked why she poured gasoline on the victim, she hesitated, then suggested that someone had told her to do it. At other times, she implied the victim had provoked her, though no specifics were ever provided. The contradictions in her account, coupled with clear attempts to deflect responsibility, demonstrated a cognitive dissonance not uncommon in offenders with co-occurring mental illness and behavioral disturbance. Her statements during psychiatric interviews contained recurring themes of being watched, followed, and manipulated. These patterns are consistent with persecutory-type schizophrenia, in which the individual perceives external forces as controlling or threatening them. However, unlike more disorganized presentations, Fields showed moments of structured reasoning. She could identify dates, locations, and personal history. She referred to her arrest history, expressed familiarity with jail procedure, and even discussed her disability payments and medication schedule. This degree of orientation, though not complete, raised questions about whether her psychosis fully obscured her moral understanding at the time of the offense. In forensic psychiatry, the question of legal insanity hinges not on diagnosis alone, but on the individual's capacity to distinguish right from wrong during the act. Fields' post-arrest inquiries about video footage and potential prison time suggested an awareness of wrongdoing. Her repeated demand to see images of the victim's injuries appeared less delusional and more compulsive, possibly reflecting a pathological need to affirm the impact of her actions. Whether this impulse stemmed from emotional detachment or a distorted sense of power remained unclear, but it reinforced the hypothesis that the attack was not merely reactive. Further complicating the analysis were her statements about race and retribution. She expressed confusion about whether the victim had been meant to burn, yet openly stated that she had never burned someone before. This comment indicates both an acknowledgement of agency and a detachment from its consequence. There was no remorse, only fixation. She continued to ask whether the victim had turned black from the burns and whether anyone else had died. Such questions suggest a cognitive emphasis on the outcome of violence, rather than its moral weight. Interviews with individuals who had interacted with Fields in the months prior revealed a pattern of escalating paranoia. She believed neighbors were recording her. She refused food from outreach workers, fearing it was poisoned. On several occasions, she was reported talking to herself aggressively on public sidewalks. Despite these warning signs, there was no sustained mental health intervention. Fields was not under guardianship, had no case manager, and was not engaged in consistent psychiatric care. Her access to medication depended on voluntary compliance and resource availability, both of which were unreliable due to her transient living conditions. This lack of structure created an environment in which persecutory ideation could spiral unchecked. Without clinical supervision, her distorted thoughts hardened into fixed beliefs. In that mental state, the act of setting someone on fire may have felt defensive, even justified, within her own internal logic. Yet, the deliberate preparation, securing fuel, identifying a location, timing the act, points toward calculated execution, even if the rationale was irrational. The legal process that followed would rest on whether Fields' mental illness rendered her incapable of understanding the nature and wrongfulness of her actions. Competency restoration programs were initiated, involving antipsychotic medication, behavioral therapy, and legal education modules. Reports submitted to the court indicated gradual improvement. Fields became more responsive, less paranoid, and increasingly oriented to the realities of her case. After several months, she was declared competent to proceed. Still, the question remained whether her psychiatric improvement represented true moral insight or simply cognitive clarity. Could someone regain mental stability after committing a violent act without ever having fully comprehended it during? This distinction would influence not only sentencing, but broader considerations of accountability and institutional responsibility. In February 2024, after a series of legal delays tied to psychiatric evaluations and competency hearings, Betty Jean Fields entered a plea of no contest to the charge of attempted first-degree premeditated murder. The plea was accepted by the court and resulted in a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The decision reflected not only the severity of the crime, but also the cumulative findings of psychiatric professionals, forensic investigators, and legal authorities. While the defense did not dispute her long-standing mental illness, the structured nature of her actions, combined with her restored competency, removed the legal basis for an insanity defense. The sentencing hearing included impact statements from the victim and her family. Joey Helck, still visibly scarred and walking with assistance, described a life permanently altered by pain, trauma, and loss of independence. She explained how everyday tasks now required external support, how mirrors had become a source of anxiety, and how her children had witnessed the long aftermath of something they could neither understand nor forget. Her words reflected a shift in identity, common among victims of disfiguring violence, from survivor to symbol, from individual to public evidence of harm. The court also heard from her coworker, Veronica, who sustained minor burns while trying to help extinguish the fire. She described lingering guilt, recurring nightmares, and a fear of confined spaces. Both women made it clear that the crime did not end when the flames were extinguished. Its psychological presence persisted in ways that conventional sentencing could not resolve. From a behavioral perspective, Fields' profile remained atypical. She did not conform neatly to established categories of violent offenders. Her actions were shaped by chronic psychiatric instability, but they also demonstrated elements of planning and intentional harm. The intersection of untreated mental illness, homelessness, and prior criminal behavior placed her within a subset of offenders whose acts are neither fully delusional nor fully rational. These individuals pose complex questions for the justice system, especially when their capacity fluctuates over time. Fields' sentence served several functions. It removed an immediate public risk, provided a measure of closure to the victims, and reinforced the court's position that severe acts of violence, regardless of mental health history, demand full legal consequence when the threshold of competency is met. However, the case also exposed gaps in institutional response. Fields had previous arrests involving erratic and aggressive behavior. She had a documented psychiatric history and multiple contacts with law enforcement. Yet no long-term intervention was in place. Her access to medication was inconsistent, and her housing was unstable. These factors combined to create a predictable trajectory toward escalation. In clinical terms, the attack was preventable. The warning signs were present in her behavior, her speech, and her past conduct. What was absent was sustained engagement through outpatient treatment, case management, or enforced psychiatric care. This failure of continuity is not unique to this case. It reflects broader systemic shortcomings in managing high-risk individuals with serious mental illness, particularly those who exist at the margins of healthcare and housing systems. The psychological harm inflicted on the victim extended well beyond the physical injuries. Long-term studies on burn survivors have shown elevated rates of depression, post-traumatic stress, and social isolation. These effects are compounded when the injury is the result of an intentional human act. In those cases, the trauma is layered, not only with pain, but with betrayal by the basic expectation of safety in public life. This betrayal complicates recovery, undermines resilience, and often delays psychological healing. From a criminological standpoint, the Fields case illustrates the limitations of reactive systems. Criminal responsibility was eventually determined, punishment was delivered, and the community moved forward. But the conditions that allowed the crime to occur remain largely unchanged. The mental health infrastructure continues to operate with limited capacity, and the overlap between psychiatric illness and criminal behavior is still poorly managed at the policy level. In closing, this case does not present a simple binary of guilt and madness. It reveals the blurred lines where intent meets delusion, where planning exists alongside hallucination, and where justice must balance protection with recognition of systemic failure. Betty Jean Fields will spend the rest of her life in prison, but the broader question remains: How many others, like her, are already on the path toward irreversible violence, unseen, untreated, and only one spark away from ignition?